I'll facilitate the discussion with Lars, and then I'll hand over to Paul after that. Okay, Lars, do you want to go for it?
Okay, so I will try to share my screen here, including the sound. And then I will try to launch this. Okay, and get rid of the floating meeting controls here. Okay, so can you see my screen now? Yeah. Well, I thought I'd start with a little background, this presentation. My research area is information systems, and the key concepts in that discipline are information technology, and information systems. But still, after more than 3 decades of research, there is no consensus about what these terms, what they actually mean. And when I came across Ilyenkov, mainly through the works of Dave Buckhurst and Peter Jones, I somehow sensed that Ilyenkov's ideas might provide a way to advance the IS discipline beyond its current deadlock. The IS discipline is, of course, an applied discipline. I mean, information technology is all around, we use it every day and we use it now. So my focus is to understand how Ilyenkov's ideas can be applied in practice, in action. And you should bear in mind that this presentation is based on a scant reading of Ilyenkov, but I hope you'll find some interesting things in it anyway. So I'll try to advance this. Yeah, the area of concern then is this: if thought is the mode of action of the thinking body, then in order to define it, we are bound to investigate the mode of action of the thinking body very thoroughly. And in no case whatsoever to investigate the structure or spatial composition of this body in an inactive state. Because the thinking body, when it's inactive, is no longer a thinking body, but simply a body. But I think this position is vindicated by recent research in neuroscience. For example, the recent discovery of a higher resting state activity in the default mode network has once again raised the argument for an intrinsic view of the brain's neural activity. The resting state may be then regarded as a necessity, non-sufficient condition, a neural predisposition of consciousness. So there might be that the neural predispositions for the ideal is under-researched, and what I will try to talk about is then is if scientific exploration of the neural predisposition, hard to say, for action can contribute to the understanding of the ideal. I will start with communication. We are born into a world which has certain communicational infrastructure already in place. It is this infrastructure which allows to participate straight away in communication with others, and that participation is a condition of our survival. From the start, we communicate in order to live. And what about this communicational infrastructure then? Well, it's comprised of 3 different types of factors. For the first one is biomechanical factors, which relate to the physical and mental capacities of the human being. And of course, these are phylogenetic in origin and has evolved during eons. Then we have macrosocial factors which relate to the practices established in a community, and these have social historical origin. And then we have circumstantial factors which relate to the specifics of the particular situation. And these factors must be in place before we as individuals can engage in any activity whatsoever. What about the macrosocial factors? Well, Ilyenkov has a lot of examples of these factors. Organized experience, crystallized patterns, standards, norms, syntactical structures, etc. But there is a need for some kind of cover terms for these macrosocial factors, I believe. And I will come up with the notion of communal anchors, the connotation of which is that these exert some kind of gravitational pull or anchoring of individual experience in a community. So I will use this in the following. Next, I will try to describe 3 different tableaus, which tries to illustrate how I think. And the first one is this one, provided by Roy Harris, which was a linguist in Oxford. Let's just stop there. He says something like this: driving home from the city center, I may know that I have to take the first turning on the left past a particular tree in order to follow the shortest route to where I live. So I look out for this tree, and when I see it, I change down to the low gear and move into the left-hand lane, preparing to make a left turn. In this way, I make the tree a landmark. I confer upon it a certain semiological value. You might say perhaps that for me, the tree means turn left here. But this would be an impoverished description of the facts of the case. The tree does not mean turn left here if I'm traveling in the opposite direction. So what's happening here is simply that I rely on seeing the tree in order to integrate certain programs of activity in my daily journeys, and there is no way this meaning, that is the integration of function, can be stated short of describing exactly the circumstances, the circumstantial factors that give rise to it. So some observation then from this activity is that meaning is constituted by the individual, and it's not embedded in or stamped on or implanted in the tree. The tree remains exactly the same. And the essence of the tree is irrelevant, whether it's birch or fir or any other kind of tree. And it remains as is after the turn, unless, of course, you crash into it, something like that. And there are no macrosocial elements involved here. There's no other person, no communication or something like that. But the activity requires some kind of neurobiological predispositions of Harris, for example, contextualizing the activity, anticipating a sequence of actions, a spatial orientation, habitualizing the activity. I mean, the next time he makes this turn, he has to recognize the tree again as a landmark. The second tableau here is this one, a bunch of soldiers navigating a ship towards some destination, having a good time drinking. And then it might happen that somebody notices a star at night that seems to be fixed. And they start talking about it. Some of the sailors might see a double star or might not see any star at all, since they're too drunk. But anyway, they say, hey, maybe we can use this for navigation, And they try it out in different sailing and navigation trips, and they find that this works kind of great, and maybe we should call it something like Polaris or whatever kind of term you have in your specific language. So some observation here then is that Polaris requires a unique signhood for each concerned sailor. And the Polaris is then integrated in navigation activity by clustering individual signs around the star. And communication is a sine qua non for this integration, of course. Communication is really important here. And the star is a means of orientation in time and space, and it turns into a communal anchor or macrosocial factor. But of course, the star itself is not affected. It keeps on shining there, independent of what we as humans do here. And the essence of the star doesn't matter. It's white dwarf or red giant or whatever. And it will remain as is, keep on shining after becoming irrelevant in navigation when we start navigating by GPS or some other means. But the activity requires some neurobiological predisposition of these sailors again, attending the star, spatial orientation, habitualizing, contextualizing the activity. And the final tableau here, as I showed this once before, but I think it's really interesting. This is my grandchild, Karin. By the time this video was shot, she was about 9 months old, and her parents are trying to treat her some Swedish words, mamma, which is mommy, lampa, which is lamp, and Papa, which is daddy, and let's see what happens here.
Vart är mamma?
Where's mommy?
Där är mamma. Ja, där är hon. Vart är lampan då?
Where's the lamp?
Vart är lampan? Där är lampan. Bra. Var är pappa?
Where's daddy?
Pappa. Där är pappa, ja. Bra, applåder.
Okay, so what kind of observations can we draw from this little scene then? Well, the first is that I think this really is a sort of essence of what communication is all about. This is where it starts and this is where it ends. The biomechanical factors here is that seeing the light of this lamp induces some kind of neural structure, which we might call A in the brain of Karin, and here in the utterance lampa induces another neural structure in her brain. And then the lampa acquires a signhood for Karin by growing a neural connection between A and B in the brain of Karin. And the sign is then constituted by Karin as the totality of these neural structures and their relation. What about the macrosocial factors then? Well, repeated utterance of lampa results in this becoming a communal anchor for Karin. And again, the essence of the bulb here is irrelevant, and of course it's not affected by her making this into some kind of communal anchor. But again, the activity here it requires some kind of neurobiological predispositions of Karin attending the lamp, utterance lampa, mama, papa, spatial orientation, contextualizing the scene, and also a recontextualizing predisposition, moving from attending mama to the lamp and to papa. Okay, so how can we make sense of this when it comes to objective activity? Well, it seems like individual action is then enabled by conferring signhood onto some important communal anchors and macrosocial factors, like the object of activity, and that presumes an objectivating predisposition. The next one is the context of the activity, which presumes a contextualizing predisposition. The spatial structure of the activity need to be attended, and that presumes a spatializing predisposition. The temporal structure of the activity is also has to be conceptualized and presumes a temporalizing predisposition. And then a normative structure of the activity presumes a habitualizing predisposition. And finally, a transition between activities presumes a recontextualizing predisposition. So the idea here is that the ideal develops in the dialectical relationship between communal anchors and neural predispositions. And we may note here that these predispositions themselves evolved from objective activity during eons in the struggle for survival of humankind. Okay, if we can use this kind of neurobiological perspective to actually see the writings of Ilyenkov in a different light, so to say. So, for example, what can be idealized? And Ilyenkov says something like this. It's inside man thus understood that the ideal exists, because inside man thus understood are all the things that mediate the individuals that are socially producing their life. Words, books, statues, etc., and also instruments of labor, from the stone axe to the bone needle to modern automated factory and the computer. And so all these things here can then be idealized. And you may ask what cannot be idealized here. And the suspicion here is that anything can perceived as relevant in integrating activity may be idealized. So what about the ideal itself then? Well, this is what Ilyenkov says about the idea. Ideality is a kind of stamp impressed on the substantial nature by social human life activity, a form of the functioning of the physical thing in the process of this activity. So all the things involved in the social process acquire a new form of existence that is not included in their physical nature and differs from it completely, their ideal form. So how would we interpret this from this sort of neurobiological perspective then? Well, it's something like this. I would really, ideal form develops in individuals by them conferring signhood onto activity relevant physical things in accordance with our evolutionarily developed neurobiological predispositions for acting in the world. And I think these three tableaus provide some kind of of substance for this position. Then, if you want to pursue this kind of inquiry, then I think there are two main cornerstones that had to be addressed. And the first one is the something called integrational linguistics, which is a radical new theory of communication elaborated by Roy Harris, who was a British linguist at Oxford University during many years. And it says something like this: science provides an interface between different human activities. They play a constant and essential role in integrating human behavior of all kinds. Signs are not given in advance, but are made. The capacity for making signs as and when required is a natural human ability. And this kind of thinking about communication is a sort of frontal attack on the Saussure's model of talking heads there. And it rejects the mainstream communication model as transmission of messages between minds. And this is important for my research in information as well, because then this integrational linguist sort of says that the information is constituted by the individual and not something that's transmitted from the outside. And the second cornerstone, I think, is the theory of functional systems developed by Piotr Anokhin. And it looks like this. Of course, I don't have time to go into all the details here, but sorry. This model provides a link then between neural predisposition and communal anchors. And I think this, you could use this to actually interpret this statement by Ilyenkov. There are not two different and originally contrary objects of investigation, body and thought, but only one single object, which is the thinking body of living real man, only considered from two different and even opposing aspects or points of view. So that's about it. I think, I believe, or well, the scientific exploration of neural predispositions for acting contributes to the further understanding of the ideal without actually questioning or jeopardizing Ilyenkov's work in any way. So that's it. Thank you. I will try to stop sharing my screen here and leave the word to Karina again. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lars. That was I thought it was very, very helpful. And you've brought us up to date with some research that maybe some of us were not aware of. So it's open to questions and discussion. Just stick your hand up or write something in the chat box, please. Oh, Ralph would like you to repeat the person associated with a theory of functional systems.
Oh, he's called Piotr Anokhin, and he was working in the same tradition as the early pioneers, Vygotsky, Luria, especially I think Luria and also Leontiev. And he was a physiologist, that tried to understand how how living creatures stay alive by self-organization. It's also links to cybernetics in a way, that the essence of the creature is to stay alive. I think it's very interesting, and particularly his model is, I think, an excellent way of actually continuing this discussion of the dialectics between the neurobiological predispositions and macrosocial factors.
Ralph, we can share the video later so you can catch up on anything you've missed because it was in the presentation. George wanted to speak.
Yeah, Lars, can you say something more about the resting state and how does that connect with the rest of what you wanted to say?
Well, it's just an indication, you know, that neural predispositions are important, you know, and I was not particularly concerned with consciousness. I think this is a very difficult question, but it sort of directs the attention towards what comes before the actual social activity of humankind or other neural organisms as well. And I think in general, you know, this has not been researched enough in activity theory or I mean, Vygotsky talked about the lower mental functions, you know, but his focus and also Luria's well, not Luria perhaps, but was on the social higher mental functions, you know, but so we didn't say much about these predispositions other than attention, memory, something like that, you know.
And what was the name of the person associated with that? Was it Nordhoff or what? I want to look it up.
Can you say again, please? You're very loud. I couldn't hear.
I'm sorry. What is the name of the person you showed on the video who wrote about this in 2000 and something?
You mean the linguist? Yeah, right. He is called Roy Harris, you know, and he is.
Okay.
I think his view of science and communication is really a radical break with mainstream communication. You know, it suits very well, I think, with Ilyenkov's ideas, you know, and if you want to pursue this kind of thinking, I really think that it should sort of investigate his idea. This is Peter Jones, who is a close friend of mine, you know, he's written a lot about Harris' ideas, you know, and it's, you will find that he writes a lot of, written a lot of books, you know, and I spent a whole year reading his works, you know, and it was still like, you know, wow, this guy, why I hadn't heard about this, because I think, you know, mainstream semiotics is very hard to understand, you know, and then it all felt neat into the puzzle I was trying to work on.
I will check that.
Oh, Andy wants to speak. Go on, Andy. You're muted.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, your hand was up.
My hand up. I didn't notice. That must be my mistake. I will speak there because I wanted to come in. I mean, so there's a number of things here. Peter Jones, now he takes Harris and it's really interesting what he does with Harris and Ilyenkov. But ultimately, there's a divergence, a potential divergence. Indeed, I would see one of the most important potential critiques of Ilyenkov's notion of ideal forms comes from where Peter Jones is coming now in his use of Harris, because it's this idea of Harris that signs aren't pre-given, they're made. And I think what came out and what you discussed is they're made by the individual, and that's a problem. So I'd say two things. I'd say firstly, if you think about Ilyenkov's discussion of money, no individual comes up with that. It's a social, historical development of the money form. that's not evolutionary. I mean, it's social historical. So I think there needs to be more care taken with your phrases of neurobiological than evolutionary. I think social historicals needs much more elaboration. But okay, so that gives you some sort of general social, which is leading to signs and ideal forms, which aren't constructs of the individual. Then also, and more generally still, and this is really where the crux of the matter is the issue of the universal. Thought as a universal, in opposition, in contradiction to material things. So this is the big question of thought and being. Being constituted by particular individuals and thought being the universals. And I think where Peter Jones is coming to develop with Harris seems to me anyway. I'm not sure. I think Peter has written recently on this with something critical, but I don't think there's a solid conception of the universal in Harris, and that would then mean it becomes difficult to avoid individualism. So. For Ilyenkov, ideal forms express the essence of objects. So if you have a particular cup of water, that's a specific, particular individual, unique cup of water, but the essence of water is H2O, which is a universal. And only thought expresses the universal, and it uses ideal forms to do it. So I'm not sure that I found what you said extremely useful, and it is suggesting to me, as fantastic as Harry sounds, there may be an issue with universals there. Those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Andy. Were you trying to reply, Lars?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't read Ilyenkov enough to understand what he means by universal, but I think there is an issue there, of course. When it comes to individual sign making, I think the idea here is that they are not constructed out of anything. It's constructed in dialectical integration with the macrosocial factors. So for example, the sign that I showed, the sound of lampa, the sound of this could never be constructed by Karen unless there is some kind of macrosocial thing out there, and I agree that this is, as I see it, a weak link with Harris, because he's so concerned with the individual construction of the sign. So the macrosocial aspect of his ideas are more or less emphasized, I think, but from a dialectical point of view, these are equally important. There is a discussion about first and second order types of language, but second order then would refer to science as a system, science consisting of systems of units in relation to each other. And this is something that Harris more or less hates, in his writings. So, but I think you have to elaborate on that side as well,
Anybody else in the queue there? Does somebody's put something in the chat? I don't know who that is. Oh, Ralph has, yeah. Did you want to speak it, Ralph? You're muted. You're laughing, but you're muted. And so are you, Paul. You're muted.
He said no.
Oh, you said no. Okay. Well, Ralph put something in the chat. Yeah, I think I would agree with Ralph. I just like to make a short point on this because I think Andy hit on something that I also found problematic, which is when you said the meaning is constituted in the individual and the tree has nothing to do with it when you're driving down the road. It could be obviously the nature of the tree is not important, but the fact that the tree is in that particular place in space does matter, because otherwise it couldn't tell you where to turn. So it is not only constituted in the individual. And that's the first point. The second thing is I don't think you've excluded it, but maybe there needs to be more emphasis in the action, at the activity side of it, because Karen it was interesting, the video, because she was turning her head, pointing, looking. It's the movement of the body and probably her parents pointing to things, and she learns to. It's one of the first things a child does is point. Very irritating at times. So the movement of the body and in relation to the object is essential. I'm not saying you excluded that, but I think you played it down a bit. I mean, you said obviously spatial structure and all these things are part of the process, but and also I think in terms of Ilyenkov and philosophical side, rather than the neurophysical, no, not rather than, and the philosophical aspect, the macrosocial, which you describe it as macrosocial, these aspects of that give, are part of the development of consciousness and ideas and thoughts. The macrosocial is not the limit. I mean, we shouldn't limit it to macrosocial, because the macrosocial is part of the material physical world, not just of human beings and social activity, but of natural physical activities and actions and forces. So, and that is it. I love this distorted expression of Spinoza. We partake, he says, we live under the aspect of eternity. We also live under the aspect of infinity and the infinite world of which we're a part, without which we wouldn't exist. So that is the universal. Obviously in an immediate sense, the child isn't relating to that, but in a wider sense it is. And it can only do what it does because it's it's under the aspect of objective natural laws, of biological laws and physical laws. Yeah. I'll just finish and then I'll be quiet. But I was pointing out that Lars and I are fans of Gerald Edelman, who wrote this book that some of you may have read, and he stresses he says that we can't limit things to neurobiological processes, but we cannot do without them either. We have to have the both, the philosophical understanding, which is why I think it's great the way you've shown that Ilyenkov can help us with this. So it's not one or the other, is what I'm saying. Sorry, go on. Okay. Anyone else?
And I just comment on that. I think, of course, there are a lot of things that need to be thought about, in such a perspective that I couldn't provide here, and it's. But for my sort of research interest, I think it's very good to see how this can be applied and in other areas. And I really think what you said, Karina, is great. You have to address these issues. But I think that I can see a very good potential of applying Ilyenkov's ideas also in other research disciplines, that then, well, maybe it's philosophical way. And I think also that they will have very practical consequences, and And this is really what I'm looking for here. So thanks for all the comments. You know, I find them very helpful and try to think about them in the future. Okay.
Thank you, Lars. Anyone else? Maybe one or two more points before we try to continue with our reading. It'd be great to hear. Oh, Andy.
I think a couple of things. The use of looking at neurobiology. One author is Rom Harry, and his stuff on discursive mind. Obviously, he draws from activity theory, but never from Ilyenkov, as far as I know, and he's heavily influenced by an interpretation of Vygotsky. Have you come across that? Because in the discursive mind, there's lots of problems with it, but he's quite good at using contemporary study of the brain, neural networks, and he sees those as functioning, as something that a person uses. The brain is something that a person uses to do things, and so I find that quite a useful. It's always interesting to read. There's real problems with Harry, but he does use the science and the neuroscience effectively. So I wondered if you knew much about that, and if you could enlighten us, because obviously I'm a bit of an amateur on these.
I don't know about him. You know, maybe you could put it in the chat box. You know, so I'll try to look at that. But I think the one thing that you said, you know, that we use the brain. You know, it's for me. This is it doesn't sound very well, you know, because the brain is part of the body. You know, it's not that like we use this thing inside, but it's I action, and not the brain. But the brain, of course, is a prerequisite for action. You know, so I think this sounds to me like a neurological fallacy in a way, you know. But I will read him with interest, you know. But I don't know about him. Sorry.
It's a functional. I mean, it's a functional idea.
Okay.
Functional definition of well, ultimately a functional definition of thought. But just and as an aside, I did once dabble in this. There's a symposium in MISQ, Management Information Systems Quarterly. It's a symposium on critical realism. I think it came out in 2014.
Yes.
So I had a paper in that with 3 co-authors who are all activity theorists.
Okay.
Where I do use Ilyenkov and ideal forms. So it's not. It's nothing to write home about. But it was great because I got to use. I basically used the first few chapters of dialectical logic, and I got it in my MASQ. So I was quite pleased with it. But it's not great shakes. But overall, it's an interesting symposium, and it may be useful.
Yeah. Can you provide a link to that? You know.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the author that you referred to, which I haven't heard about. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. Does anyone else want to make a comment? Nope.
I would.
Okay, go ahead, Ralph.
Well, just one.
You're frightened.
Okay, just one quick thing to inform myself. Lars, at the very beginning, you mentioned something that we philosophers call an INES condition. Was that for real, or did you just happen to use it?
Sorry, I didn't get it. It's too loud.
I'm sorry. Philosophers talk about INUS conditions, INUS, and that's an necessary, an insufficient but necessary insufficient condition. And you mentioned something like that at the very beginning when you discussed the resting state. It's an old interest of mine.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, you know. Just perhaps.
I'll write you about it.
Okay.
I'll send you a message about it. It's okay.
Just Lars, George was talking about the insufficient but necessary condition that you referenced in your talk.
Yes, yes.
And I'd just like to say, George, Gerald Edelman also discusses that in the book. I put it in the chat box. You probably know it.
I do, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the necessary conditions. I mean, the different types of neurological predispositions are requisite condition, I think. But then, of course, there are lots of other things that must be in place. You know, emotions, motivation. You know, but if one of these predispositions is not working, if you get a lesion in the brain, for example, in the hippocampal area, or then you can't figure out how the space around you looks, you know. So all this must be in place in order to act, you know, And they also, I think, they also interact. I mean, the totality of these predispositions must be in place, you know, because obviously time and space are very much related, you know. And, so it's sort of minimal, I think, a set of predispositions that must be in place. And I would add also that, of course, these are the same as you find in neural organisms in more or less extensions, you know. I mean, the big apes, you know, have all these kind of predispositions, you know, but man has something else, you know. The human, I don't like the word man, but human is, and this is, I think, what Ilyenkov is talking about, you know. But these predispositions are also found in actually all organisms to some extent, you know.
Lars, thank you for that. Before we move on to the reading, I actually had a question to Lars and maybe anyone else who's familiar with this area. Given the big developments in neuroscience since there was a revolution in neuroscience in the 90s. And as I understand it on my minimal research on the subject, the neuroscientific field in the last decade and at the present time is focused very much on examination, the complexity of the neurological structures, which is now accessible through MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and very huge developments in micro studies of the brain functioning. And what I'm curious about is that reflected in I haven't seen that reflected in theorizations, philosophical theorizations, and also how does the understanding of neuroplasticity, which is a big development in the last decade, for those who don't, neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to develop and change constantly in response to its own physical activities. When to me that's a kind of powerful affirmation of Ilyenkov's understanding that our brain develops in relation to and our body movements.
I think this was already in the early writings of Luria and Vygotsky, you know. They call this functional organs, you know, which is then exactly what you described here, that the brain actually develops new connections and new functionality by participating in object activity. And in neuroscience today, I think it's in a sense in a very, very sad state, you know, because their interest is really going behind the outside the nose, you know. They're all interested in what's going on in the brain, and this is, I think, where Ilyenkov's thought could provide a great enhancement on neuroscience, because then you have to take the dialectical interaction between brain and society into consideration, which I think is rarely done today, you know, at least as I understand it. So it's actually about, you know, the interaction between disciplines, you know, yeah, the the information systems field is then also in a bad state because it doesn't really consider, you know, the individual at all. You know, they are all talking about social technique, social materiality, but the individual is sort of lost in the discussion there. You know, this is what I'm trying to change in a way. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Lars. And just to add to that, this question of time, individual time and social time, which is the fourth dimension, is required for
Yes.
higher cognitive functions. We can only have higher cognitive functions because we have a sense of time. Anyway, that's another. Yeah. So shall we move on to the next section of the reading? Is everybody happy?
It's worth mentioning that cognitive science and developments in cognitive science through this 4E, embodied, inactive, and two other E's I can't remember, mind, seems much more interesting than what you're describing in information systems and neuroscience. One of the big things they talk of is mirror neurons. Have you come across this, Lars? You're muted.
Yes, I have, but not to a very deep level, you know. But it's actually, you know, that, well, if you see somebody doing action, you know, the very same areas of the brain is activated as when you do the action yourself. You know, if a monkey sees some other monkey eating a banana, you know, so it's an indication, you know, that the social what do you call it, nature of our being is of course fundamental. You know, I mean, but there needs to be some kind of infrastructure in place in order for that to develop, I think. And this is where the predispositions come into place, which of course then develop differently in different communities that you participate in, you know, but they have the same basic evolutionarily developed infrastructure to develop this culture specific abilities.
Thanks, Andy. Shall we move on then to the reading? So, would somebody like to start? It's the paragraph which starts in this fetishization of the ideal's verbal existence, which is towards the top of page 10. Anyone volunteering to read? Frank, you're a great reader. Have you got it there? I don't think he can hear me. I'll read it. I don't care. Is everybody on the same page? Is anybody confused about where we're reading? No. Okay. In this fetishization of the ideal's verbal existence, Marx and Engels confronted left Hegelianism in the era of its corruption. Such a fetishization of the verbal existence of the ideal, and moreover, in a mediated form of that real system of social relations which it represents, proves to be an absolutely inevitable finale of any philosophy not grasping that the ideal is engendered and reproduced only by the process of a social being's objective and practical activity, transforming nature, and that it only exists during the course of this process until that time as this process endures, continues and reproduces itself on an extended scale. That's a terrible sentence, I have to say, but If then, as Marx remarked, this process were to stop even for a week, then not only the ideal, but the person as the subject of ideal activity would disappear. And when thought, that is, activity in ideal form, activity with ideal images, is interpreted in another way, not as activity with real things based on symbols and mediated through them, but as activity with the symbols themselves, then it obtains as a punishment some form or other of fetishism of both the external world and of the symbols. Do you want me to stop there? Because it's a very terribly complicated paragraph. Maybe we could just look at that first half of it. Unfortunately, I think this really needs to be broken down in the translation. But and also, Olga, should verbal be linguistic?
I haven't any notices to this fragment, and it seems to me that we should continue up to the end of this paragraph, because the last part is explains
Okay.
the previous.
Okay, I'll keep on reading. The existing state of social relationships, their existing forms, on the one hand, and the existing expression of these forms of reality in language, in the existing terminology and syntactic structures on the other, begin to appear simply as sacred, as a savage's idol, as a Christian's cross. That is the only possible earthly embodiment of the ideal, its genuine, although somewhat distorted earthly conditions of appearance. The most comical result is that any variant of the fetishized ideal in the form of its verbal symbolic existence does not grasp the ideal itself as such. It grasps the results of human activity, that is the motion that creates these results, and not the human activity itself creating and reproducing these results. Okay. Oh, sorry, Paul, you were going to facilitate this, sorry. I could do with some help.
You started, Corey, you better finish.
No.
Okay, right, okay, I'll carry on. Just, is there anybody who wants to start a discussion on this very long paragraph? Olga, you wanted to say something or not? You said the second half answers the first half. Is that what you said?
It seems to me that this is a continuation of previous themes, and Ilyenkov criticizes this removal or, как это сказать, substitutions, some representatives bodies by the ideality by the some representative bodies. And this fetishization occurs not only in thinking of not very educated persons, but in theories, in philosophical theories, and so on. This is the same mechanism.
Thank you, Olga. Ralph, you put something in the chat box. Did you want to explain what this is?
Right. Why not, if you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think if you're familiar with Marx's critique of the left Hegelians, you'll understand it. If not, basically, Marx is showing that they're just dealing with the ideological forms of appearance and not with the underlying social relationships that govern them. Because left Hegelians were fighting about religion and politics, but they didn't ground it in anything. In fact, they grounded it less than Hegel grounded his ideas. So that part I think is comprehensible. The sentence that I quoted I think is very interesting because if one begins with primitive magical thinking and religion all the way up to Hegelianism, one sees in the entire history of the idealist nature of most human reflection. That is, not critically understanding it as a product of their own history in their attempts to grasp reality, but simply accepting basically a superstitious thinking or idealist philosophy as actually the nature of the real. That's what he's saying there in a rather complicated sentence. And that, I think, is worth thinking about.
Thanks, Ralph. Anybody want to take on from where Ralph has finished to the point that he made? Any further thoughts about this very long paragraph? Anybody? If not, we'll move on. Anybody? No.
Maybe this criticism is concerned to such theories which emphasizes the significance of language. For example, Heidegger, when in his theory, language is a house of the being itself, and so on. Maybe this is methodological core of criticism, of Ilyenkov's criticism of such approaches. Because language is not the ideal itself, and we must discern between these two.
Okay, thank you, Olga. Any other points on this, Karina? You're muted.
Yeah, I agree with Olga. I also would say that that the middle part of that paragraph, when he says it obtains as a punishment, I think it should be receives as a punishment. But anyway, then he says that the existing state of social relationships, their existing forms on the one hand, and so on, that is, he's talking about the alienation that takes place in basically capitalist society, and that it's these social relations, which is a separation of the producer, the worker, or the human being from the results of their labor and from commodity, the separation that goes on through the process of capitalist production and marketing and the whole chain of from the production of the commodity to its purchase. That is the process of alienation, and that is that makes these things appear sacred or fetishized, which we see. Like if you take a Nike trainer, which is fetishized by millions of young people, it costs the earth. Why is it like that? Why does it appear like that? Because people are alienated from the producers, who are some slave labor and neo-slave labor in China, and they're purchased by or treasured by very oppressed young people in the black parts of America, for example, or in this country. So, it's this distorted fetishization is intimately a result of the alienation that we have in society today. And extreme forms of it, I would say, extreme, even more extreme than when Ilyenkov was writing.
Okay, thank you, Karina.
This is interesting that in this point, the attention of Ilyenkov is directed to the top position, because the representatives of the top social positions are alienated too. And their way of alienation is this mode of theoretizing that displayed, как это сказать, not displayed, closed before them, closes before them the reality, the real modes of behaving with things, with real things. They must be scientists, theorists, but they cannot grasp the truth because of this alienation.
So what you're saying, Olga, this was also true about the Soviet bureaucracy as well as capitalism. He is also referring to the people running the Soviet Union as well, you think? Do you think this is directed at them too? Because they also had a very slender grasp of reality as well, in terms of what was happening to the economy and socially. It was a great surprise to them when things went the way they did, as you know. And in fact, it seems that the only people that really knew what was going on were the top levels of the KGB in terms of the crisis of the economy and so on and so forth. So I think you're right. I think this it's not just about the West, not just about capitalism. It's also about what was going on, arguably, inside the Soviet Union as well. Anybody else on this paragraph before we move on to the next, even longer paragraph? No. We should need to get an automated reading app from Google to read this out. Corinna has a funny story to tell later on about a translation problem with Google where they declined to translate a reference to Hegel. It was a blind spot of the algorithm. So, but anyway, leaving that aside for the moment, who is up for reading the next paragraph? Therefore, it does not. Anybody?
Jerry, why don't you do it?
I'll do it.
Oh,
Save Jerry having to answer that one.
okay.
So I think we're on therefore, I believe. So it's the paragraph beginning therefore.
Yes, that's right. That's right, Andrew.
Okay, right, here we go then. Therefore, it does not capture the ideal itself, but only its frozen products alienated in external objects or in language. This is not surprising, for the ideal as a form of human activity also exists only in activity and not in its results. For activity is also this constant, enduring negation of the existing, sensuously perceptible forms of things, their changes, their sublation into new forms, proceeding from universal laws expressed in ideal forms. When the object is created, the need for society in it is satisfied, whereas when the activity has been extinguished in its product, the ideal itself has also perished. An ideal image of bread, let us say, emerges in the representation of a hungry person or in a baker who is making bread. No ideal bread emerges in the mind of a well-fed person building a house. But if we are to take society as a whole, both ideal bread and an ideal house always exists, and any ideal object with which a real person actually deals with in the production and reproduction of real material life, including an ideal sky as an object of astronomy, as a natural calendar, a clock, and a human compass. As a result, the whole of nature with which she deals is idealized in a human being, and not only that part of it which she directly produces and reproduces, or directly consumes in a utilitarian manner. Without a constantly renewed idealization of real objects of social and human life activity, without the transformation of them into the ideal, and in this way, without its symbolization, a human being cannot appear as an actual agent, an active subject of social production of society's material and cultural life, as an active mediator between natural bodies and the measure of all things engaged and involved in social production. From the dialectical complexities and contradictions which emerge in social and human activity, and from which sprout forth all the variants of fetishistic representations of the ideal, starting with the primitive symbolization of social relations of production in the savages' symbolic fetishes, and ending with the enlightened fetishism of the neo-positivists, transforming language, signs and symbols into an autonomous force external to and independent of the human existing and acting as God, and then as the devil, as the original source of all the blessings and evils in history.
Okay, amen to that. So who would like to begin to unravel this paragraph? Was Ilyenkov saying, therefore, it does not. What is it? It does not? What's that referring to? Anybody? Lars?
Just a comment or thought about the second sentence there, that the ideal as a form of human activity also exists only in activity and not in its results. But I think that the results then are sort of prerequisite for next activities, you know. So there is the results are in a way, you know, equally important as the activity itself, you know, because I mean this has to do with the infrastructure that I was talking about. So it's just a remark there. And then I think that a little bit later on, you know, it says that let's see now. Well, no ideal bread emerges in the mind of a well-fed person building a house. And this to me sounds like, you know, the contextualization thing here, that depending on the context of activity, you know, the bread is either relevant or not relevant, you know, and it all depends on the kind of role that the bread plays in this particular activity. If you're hungry, then that's another thing. Then if you're building a house, if you're building a house, the bread might not be relevant at all, you know, unless you become hungry or something like that. It's just some kind of thoughts that appeared in my mind.
Thanks, Lars. Anybody else on this question of activity, only in activity and not in its results? That's clear.
I circulated some remarks by Rodney and Arinsibia to most of you. I think you've all seen them, except maybe not Frank. I think Rodney explained this really well, and I think Lars has a point there, because Ilyenkov is emphasizing the vanishing nature of activity, which of course only exists in the moment. It's like music. It only exists in the moment, and when it's done, it's done. But it is true what Lars says, that can then be the basis for the next moment of development, and in that sense, it does persist. But the way that Rodney described it, I thought was helpful, because he talked about ideality. The ideality is in the object, can persist and does persist. If you take a painting, it's there frozen. The ideality is there frozen, and it comes to life when we look at the painting, and it doesn't mean anything when nobody's looking at the painting. It's just paint. But the potential ideality is embodied in the object, frozen as frozen in it, if you want to use that word, frozen. So it's both there and not there. It's it's a dialectical contradiction, which is the magic of art, actually. It's why it appears magical, because and so powerful, because we know it can disappear so easily, and it does disappear. I mean, I think it's very important. And sorry, shut me up if I'm going on, but if you take, for example, when we've had the pandemic, we can't go to concerts, we can't go to live theater, we can't go to see a painting, and yet when you do that now, if you have a chance to do it, a lot of people are moved to tears. It's extremely emotional, because we haven't had that connection. But we're listening to Mozart or Schumann or whatever, and that those notes on the paper are still there. There's an ideality about it in that sense. Oh, sorry to go on.
Hey, anybody else on this thought? Andrew.
A couple of things. There's a tension in both the paragraphs we've read between a transhistorical, very abstract account of the emergence of ideas in any society, and the fact that Ilyenkov's using the specific historical example of capitalism and the account of money that precedes the paragraphs that we're reading. So it's important to bear that tension in mind. For the most part, what both of these paragraphs are actually doing is they're very abstract. They're really a transhistorical account of mind, of thought, of the ideal, and he's used the capitalism and money as an example. He's not talking specifically about capitalistic ideas. He's just using them as an example of the birth of the idea and its relation to matter in general. So the first paragraph that we read, it's interesting. He refers at some point to what I presume is Marx's letter to Kugelmann, where Marx says that if people stopped, if not for, I can't remember the exact phrases, but if people stop acting, stop buying and selling things for not very long, then the whole of society collapses. Specifically money and its power and commodities, they cease to have any of that. So people have to keep on going in capitalistic relations, ongoing activity of exchange and production for capitalistic, what we take as taken for granted ideas to be reproduced. I think throughout the two paragraphs as well, the main point he's making is twofold. The first point is that the social relations of production have to be in place, and those social relations of production are prior to ideas in some sense. So, I mean, that's it. That's quite important. And then the main criticism he's making in these two paragraphs is of all forms of interpretation of ideas which simply omit the social relations of production and think somehow our minds transpose to objects meaning absent the social relations of production and the process of production which is ongoing. So those are the main points. It just keeps banging on about it again and again. In some sense, it's quite simple and it's quite traditional Marxist, but what's specific and interesting and not traditional is his specific understanding of the ideal forms and of meaning, of the need for these ideal forms to arise, these objective ideal forms like money and lots of other things. They have to be there, they have to acquire meaning. The meaning they have is of the essence of other objects. So money has the meaning of the value of other commodities. That's what he keeps repeating in these two paragraphs. So I don't find them, they're a bit of a pain, but he just keeps saying the same thing over and over. And what he's saying is actually quite, is quite profound. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it.
Okay. I mean, I think the other thing that comes out in the first few lines is this reference now to negation, sublation, and to new forms proceeding from universal laws. I think this is very important. It's beginning to show this transition in form through this process of negation and the incorporation of the results of negation into a new form. So I think that's quite critical in a sort of, in the first 4 or 5 lines, he's doing that too. So if there are no other points here about this paragraph, I think we can't really begin another paragraph today. But if there are any other concluding points on this paragraph, we'll take them now, and then we'll go back to Corinna to see where we go from here. Well, I thought we might make a lot more progress today, but we didn't have a lot of time. We'll be hard pressed to do this in another session, but perhaps we should attempt to do that. But any other points? Yeah, anyway. Okay. Corinna, you want to take it from here?
Yeah. Well, we've got, the plan is to, well, first of all, thank you all. Thank you, Lars. It's been really, I think, really important session. Yeah, but the plan was roughly that we devote the first session in May to the next page. And as Paul mentioned, if we really pushed ourselves, we could finish it, because it's two and a half, is it 3 more pages? Is it 2? Page 11 and 12. I haven't got 13 in front of me. Anyway, and then
there's another page 13 as well.
Yeah, so 3 more pages. Quite a, we've been managing about 1 page a session, 1.5. But maybe, like Andy says, he does go over the same ground. He's a bit like a sculptor. He's sculpting his statue from all the sides. Well, we can try. But Andy and Sasha, I hope Sasha's feeling okay. Not here today. Sasha Surmava, we're going to give us an introduction to dialectical logic. Should we do that in the second session in May, Andy, do you think?
I don't know about Sasha's preferences, so we can get in touch with him and find out what he wants to do. I'd be happy to do it the session after the next one. That would be fine with me.
Okay.